These are the creatures that you may eat from among all the land animals. Any animal that has true hoofs with clefts through the hoofs and that chews the cud, such you may eat. The following, however, of those that either chew the cud or have true hoofs you shall not eat. The camel, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs, it is unclean for you. The damam, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs, it is unclean for you. The hare, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs, it is unclean for you. And the swine, although it has true hoofs, with the hoofs cleft through, it does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you. You shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses, they are unclean for you. That's a pretty strong warning, and it comes from a pretty serious place. This is from the Torah, which is otherwise known as the Old Testament. It's the most foundational text of the Jewish tradition, and I got this copy at my bar mitzvah. Bear with me. A few weeks ago, you met Jeremy Keene from Brassica Kitchen, and he and his team put together this really fantastic box of fermented products that I subscribed to in January because the restaurants are closed and it's a nice way of keeping in touch with the restaurants that we care about. And in that fermentation box were all sorts of goodies. The first is this fermented pepper hot sauce. I'm almost done with it. The second was a black apple butter. It smells incredible, a little salty, a little tart, a little pungent. But one of the things that really stuck out at me is this 3-year nduja, which is a Calabrian salami. It's a little bit soft. It's made from a pig that's been aged a couple of years, hung up inside, and cured. Now, it looked delicious, but it also gave me some feelings. The first feeling, of course, is that I was raised as a vegetarian, and I didn't have meat for the first time until I was in college and was experimenting with something new. So that's the first reason that it made me feel kind of strange. And the second reason I felt a little bit off about it was what was written in that text just there. It's unclean. Now maybe this needs a little bit of explanation or a little bit of teasing out. If there's one thing that Jews and Muslims are good at, it's not eating pork. In fact, it's an extremely strong food taboo in both of those communities. I wasn't exactly raised with this taboo because I was raised as a vegetarian, and that particular text isn't really meaningful to me except for in a cultural sense. But there's a pretty strong taboo against pig eating for many Jews, even if they're broadly secular ones. I think the same thing goes with many Muslims as well. And there's many food taboos that people feel in different communities that are not necessarily about pig, but are really strongly felt. So when I got this 3-year nduja, it looked amazing on the one hand, but it also made me feel a little bit funny. I looked inside and there's this wrapping paper here and this incredibly kind of pungent, spicy smell here. Just have a look. That is some real intense pig product right there. So the question, of course, is what are food taboos? What does this all mean? Why are some foods okay to eat and some foods not okay to eat? And what does it mean when we choose to break these food taboos or to not take them seriously but still kind of hold them in our mind? We're going to explore all of this today with the help of an anthropologist who's going to make sense of some of the ways we think of food and meaning in antiquity but also in the present day. If I'm feeling brave, I might actually try this nduja. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, Benjamin Siegel here, and welcome back. Today we're going to turn our attention to the intersection of food and meaning. How do humans create meaning from food, and how do they attribute value to the foods that they eat or don't eat? We're going to be talking a lot about religion today because so many of our ideas about food are elemental to what we believe and vice versa. And we're going to be jumping back and forth across time and between place to place, but we're also going to spend a lot of time talking about antiquity and before pre-recorded history. We're going to follow the influence of theories over time and try to outline a couple of different big ways that anthropologists and other people concerned with making meaning have thought about the intersections of food and meaning and culture over time. Today we're going to focus a lot less on the religious reasoning for the food that people do eat, and instead we're going to focus on the religious and cultural reasons why people refrain from eating certain things. These theories in some ways are a little more interesting, but they're also a little more unifying between place to place. We have bigger overarching theories. And we're going to be covering a lot of different ground, jumping from place to place. But let's start out with a basic. In lots of cultures, both modern and in antiquity, food is an instrumental way of ensuring the good relationship between human beings and their gods. What's one way that you could think about this? Think about Christianity, something that's familiar to many of you. In Christianity, you've got that central image of the consumption of bread. It goes back to that image of Christ and his disciples at the Last Supper, but it gets repeated over time by the faithful as they take the communion ritual, going for communion. And in that tradition, the bread, sometimes called the host, becomes the body of Christ. And it stands in for all these bigger religious ideas about redemption and holiness and salvation. It's a practice where believers literally eat their God, and so in doing so, they physically incorporate the values and messages of their religion. Many people used and still do use food to cajole or to urge their gods into doing something for them. Ancient Greeks, like many other people in antiquity, used food sacrifices as a ways of appeasing their gods or to butter them up to do something for them. It happens today in practices of Tibetan Buddhism, among other religious traditions, where communities give their gods food offerings, and then they say, since I'm offering you the things that you eat, you've now got to do what I demand. Now, we don't always just give our food to gods. Sometimes we give our food to our ancestors or dead people. It's a way of ensuring good relations with them, too, if they're looking down on us. Again, going back to that image of Christianity, let's think about All Souls Day or All Souls Eve, an important holiday throughout the Christian world. And in different ways and in different cultures, people make food offerings and prepare entire feasts for the dead. Sicilians eat things like fava beans in a lot of traditions. There's the consumption of cooked cereals. In Sardinia on All Souls Day, there's something called la mesa. It's the table, and it's a meal for the deceased that Sardinians lay out as they go to bed the night before. It always has things in it like spaghetti or papassini. It's a special cookie that's made for All Souls Day. And then there's things like bread, nuts, fruits, even things like wine, beer, Coca-Cola, juice, coffee, and then tobacco and cigarettes. For Sardinians, there's this idea of giving food to your own dead relatives, and often the foods that are given in this tradition are the foods that human beings liked when they were alive. It's a way that Sardinians, like many other people, communicate and keep up good relationships with the dead, just as food exchanges do for the living when you invite someone over for a meal or you accept their invitation. In some cultures, the living actually even eat the dead to honor them and to also maybe gain some of their powers. This is a practice that lots of people have looked at, like Sigmund Freud. Dr. Freud argued that by absorbing parts of the body of a person through the act of eating, we can also come to possess the properties which belong to that person. But he said it, of course, in German, so it sounded smarter. This is something that we see if we look at the Yanomami Indians in Venezuela and Amazon. After a cremation, they will eat the ashes of their deceased loved ones to ensure that they're going on to a successful afterlife. There's the story of an anthropologist who was sick with malaria working among these Indians, and his informants comforted him by saying, don't worry, when you're gone, we'll hunt your ashes. That's maybe a little extreme, but consumption is a way of establishing connection between the living and the dead, between humans and the divine, between neighbors and kin, and among family members, as we all know. Anthropologists are really good at helping us understand the beliefs that people have about what's good to eat or desirable to eat for religious reasons. But maybe more interesting for our purposes is to understand why people wouldn't eat certain things. We can eat everything in the world, so why would we refrain? This is actually more of a paradox. Think for a minute about something that you don't eat, and maybe along a sort of religious or cultural grounds. It's kind of strange when you think about it. So much of human history is the story of people trying to get enough food to eat and survive. So why would people from before recorded history hold back from eating things that had some kind of caloric value for them? So to answer that question, we're going to leave history for a minute and we're going to go into the world of anthropology. And before doing that, we should draw a distinction between two important terms. The first is an aversion, and the second is a taboo. When food habit researchers use the term aversion, they're describing certain disliked or inappropriate foods. And some human food aversions are immediate, when you taste a food and you dislike it immediately because of the way it smells, because of the way it tastes, or sometimes like the texture that it has is kind of gross. Other foods you might avoid or have an aversion to because of a physiological condition. You might get nausea or vomiting, things like heartburn or acid reflux. Certain foods might make you fart or give you intestinal distress. But some food aversions are cultural or psychological in their origin, when people report that they dislike specific foods even before they've ever tasted them for the first time. So an aversion is something it's a kind of individualized response, but it may be conditioned by cultural things. But a taboo is something different. A taboo implies a kind of moral or religious context that structure foods or food-related behavior. Taboo was a really strong concept in Polynesian society, and it didn't refer just to food. A Polynesian chief might be taboo when he was getting his face tattoos done, and a person might be rendered taboo for a while after his contact with sickness or the dead. But we know that term now about something that's taboo, and in a general sense it means a couple of different things. It might refer to a kind of human activity, and often an eating behavior, that's deleterious to the environment, to the consumer, or to society at large. And food-related taboos in this context are really tied into religious dietary prohibitions or cultural dietary prohibitions, where food or the eating of certain foods gets forbidden for specific positive or negative reasons. People follow food prohibitions or taboos for a broad range of ecological, environmental, religious, and social reasoning, and it crosses categories of foods. One thing that's shared among most communities is that if you violate a food taboo, there's kind of a consequence. There's a social ostracization that can be involved when you eat something that your community says you're not supposed to eat. You can be condemned personally or socially as being immoral or not fitting to the community. Some taboos are not permanent. They come at certain times of the year. They are meant to protect food crops at different points in the growth cycle. And some might have an economic rationale. There might be a reason that you are prohibited from eating a certain food so as to distribute things in a more egalitarian way among different individuals or groups in society. But most food-related taboos are religious in nature, and they provide structure and regulate individual and social behavior in a community. While individual food dislikes might lead ultimately to food prejudice, food dislikes aren't the same as taboos. And neither are food disaversions. We can think of taboos as having their basis in behavioral, ecological, or religious strictures. And so, a food-related taboo will probably result in food avoidance behavior, but food-related avoidance patterns don't necessarily result in taboos. While we're going to talk for a little bit about food taboos that have their origins in religion, many of them don't. There's lots of food taboos in different cultures that have their origins in questions of identity, things like gender and age, who can eat what, when, and at what times of the month or the year. So this should give us a lot of questions about how dietary prohibitions or taboos reinforce gender roles in society and characterize different rites of passage like birth, coming of age, marriage, death. Food taboos might be one way that we structure the human life cycle. When can you eat a certain food and when can you not eat that same food? That might differ over the course of a person's lifetime. We know a lot about the dietary habits of at least one ancient culture, so let's talk a little bit about their religious food taboos, since it's a little further away from our own. And that's of ancient Egypt. We know a lot about the grains and vegetables and fruits that ancient Egyptians ate from their hieroglyphics. But we also have many descriptions of what the Egyptians didn't eat, and notably, they didn't eat beef. The historian Herodotus, who was writing in the 5th century BC, said that Egyptian priests abstained from beef, and specifically the flesh of cows, maybe not water buffaloes, and that this dietary pattern went beyond the cultural boundaries of Egypt, westward into Libya and elsewhere into northern Africa. Another historian, Philochorus of Athens, tried to explain that taboo. He wrote down his idea that at one time there was a dearth of cows, maybe a cow plague, and that there was a law passed on account of that scarcity that the Egyptians should abstain from eating them since they wanted to build up that herd population again. We're not sure if that's true or not, but we know that by the 3rd century of the Common Era, another historian said that Egyptians would rather taste human flesh than the flesh of a cow. But here's something weird about the ancient Egyptians. Greek and Roman commentators say everywhere that ancient Egyptians weren't eating beef. But there's a lot of archaeological evidence saying that ancient Egyptians might not have refrained from eating beef after all. There's actually thousands of carvings and paintings and hieroglyphics in Egypt that depict the killing of cattle, butchers at work cutting up carcasses, the display of beef and organ meats in shops, boiling and roasting beef. Doesn't sound like there was much of a taboo for these ancient Egyptians at all. So let's take something away from this. Since the beginning of Egyptology, there's been a really big debate in the field. Some Egyptologists follow the archaeological evidence, and they say, well, ancient Egyptians were eating tons of beef. Others follow what the historians and the textualists wrote. The textualists really have dug down into this position. One writer in the 19th century said that in a country possessing neither extensive pasture lands nor great abundance of cattle, the cow was held sacred and consequently was forbidden to be eating. And this is kind of an argument that we're going to come back to in just a second. But maybe there's the possibility that not all cows were sacred in ancient Egypt. Maybe the deification or the making into gods of bulls and cows in ancient Egypt wasn't about a question of available pasture land or managing herds, but was related to specific physical characteristics of individual bulls and cows instead. Historians have tried to sort of put these two pieces of the puzzle together, and they say that probably there was a limited or partial beef prohibition that was intact during late and post-dynastic Egypt. But we can't say whether the prohibition applied to all varieties of beef, or specifically to cows, or maybe to female calves, or other types of bovines. So it suggests to us that not all cows were taboo, or maybe they were taboo to Egyptians at different times, seasonal or individual, as opposed to just a big blanket taboo or prohibition. Let's go to a different set of food taboos, one that we might know about from contemporary and ancient Judaism. There's two central texts for Jews that give dietary laws and traditions. There's the Torah and the Talmud. The Torah comes from ancient oral traditions, and it was codified in its present form by around the 6th century before the Common Era. The Talmud is a much longer document. It's produced in Babylon and in Jerusalem, and it's finished by around the 6th century of the Common Era, so around 1200 years later, and it gives broad guidelines for Jewish moral conduct, and it incorporates lots of different discussions and critical assessments of food-related issues. If we go through Jewish tradition, there's a development and an evolution of dietary codes that we can read throughout changing texts. If we go to the beginning of the Torah, to Genesis right at the beginning, all products on earth are clean, and plant foods are the initial diets of human beings. If we go back to the famous flood of the Hebrew Bible, we see that there's a differentiation between clean and unclean animals, but they're not identified or specified, and all of those animals make it onto Noah's Ark. They're saved that way. Afterwards, after the flood is done and Noah comes off the ark, Noah and his descendants are given all food to eat except for blood. And an appropriate human diet is a little different then. It's seen as a combination of plant and animal foods. There's a specification between clean and unclean flesh foods, other forbidden foods and food-related behaviors are codified, and certain animals become clean and unclean. You can't eat things like amphibians, lots of birds, insects, and pigs. We'll come back to pigs. There's other smaller prohibitions against blood, carrion, fat, sinew, other things that really are just kind of mired down in details. And then later, during the time of the writing of the Talmud, there's a new prohibition against the mixing of milk and meat products, owing to a commandment not to cook a calf in its mother's milk that comes from the middle of Exodus. In modern times, these prohibitions are central to the cultural expression of Judaism, and they're the source of tremendous debate. But there's no specific, explicit prohibition against mixing milk and meat in the Torah. In fact, in the Torah, there's lots of instances of Jews who are consuming milk and meat together in the same meal, doing things like cooking beef in butter. But Jewish scholars, beginning in the 6th century, began to formulate more and more complicated rules. They decided that milk and meat products needed to be cooked and consumed separately, though there was always that question of what counted as milk and what counted as meat. Then there were also debates on how long consumers should wait before dining on the other food class, so that the food categories don't mix inside the human body. How long do you wait after having a piece of meat to have a glass of milk? So Jews in the medieval period started to divide food into 3 categories: dairy, meat, and parav. Parav was a category that meant neither milk nor meat. Of course, as with all food prohibitions across religions, there's questions of how to navigate this in the modern world. How should an Orthodox Jew, for instance, deal with the question of purchasing meat and cheese from different sections of the same store? Or in what kind of restaurants could she or he eat? Where can milk and meat be stored, and how should they be divided as you store them, cook them, or serve them? These questions are still really important for Jews in the modern world. But in antiquity, they became important to another group of people in particular. The first Christians, who wondered whether all food should be allowed, or whether portions of the Jewish dietary code should be incorporated into the new religion of Christianity. In the earliest texts of the New Testament, the early position regarding dietary taboos was a repudiation of earlier Jewish food laws, and the concept that all foods were basically acceptable for Christians. But then there was debate among Christians, and it permitted converts to maintain their earlier dietary restrictions. It was one of the ways in which Christianity made itself appealing to a broader audience in its early years. And by later in the New Testament, it was clear that some Jewish dietary laws had made their way back into the early practice of the religion. In the New Testament book of Acts, for instance, there's a prohibition against blood, carrion, things that had been strangled, and foods that had been previously offered to idols. So these were things carried over from Jewish practice. But later on in the New Testament, there's that commandment that says, "Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God." That comes from Corinthians. And that's a pretty laissez-faire, do-what-you-will attitude about food, and it's basically continued for most Christians into the present. But if there was little in the way of restrictions on food in the history of early Christianity, there was a lot of concern over food in questions of physical as opposed to spiritual health. St. John, who was an important 4th century Christian leader and author of a lot of different religious texts, also wrote, like many early Christian leaders, on diet. One of his major themes was that reduced food intake and regular fasting were important for practicing Christians. And fasting is important in many Christian traditions today. But absolute food prohibitions within Christianity, that's a much newer phenomena, and it's initiated by newly formed denominations. It's not part of older Christian traditions. There's, of course, the Seventh-day Adventists, who maintain many of the dietary prohibitions of the Jews against foods on the unclean lists from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Seventh-day Adventists also abstain from alcohol, and they frown upon hot spices and condiments, things like chili pepper or black pepper, even aged cheeses. For Seventh-day Adventists, those who indulge in meat eating, tea drinking, and gluttony are sowing seeds for a harvest of pain and death. You can think about other prohibitions for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes called the Mormons. They reject alcohol and the so-called hot drinks, which are defined broadly as coffee and tea. If we look at another tradition, that of Islam, we find a slightly different story. For Muslims, dietary prohibitions are documented in 2 different places, the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, which for Muslims is the divine word of God revealed by the Prophet Muhammad, food is divided into 2 basic categories, food that is halal or permitted, and haram or forbidden. The Quran specifically forbids 6 types of food categories: blood, carrion, pork, intoxicating beverages made from grapes, intoxicating drugs, and, like the Jews, foods previously dedicated or offered to idols. The Hadith is a little bit broader in its scope. It's the collected traditions and sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and they contain a broad range of food-related passages. Muslims, for instance, can't hunt when they're on a religious pilgrimage to Mecca, doing the Hajj. There are also specific restrictions on how slaughter must be carried out of animals. When animals are slaughtered, the name of God must be mentioned, specifically the phrase, "in the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful." That Bismillah phrase is really important. It's a textual example of how a food becomes acceptable to practitioners. There's also specific restrictions on how an animal should be killed. For Muslims, it's the throat of the animal that has to be cut with a knife, and there's an exception made for just 2 different foods. Fish, because their throat already has gills, and locusts, because they're said to spring forward and aspire to heaven. We're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about one prohibition seen within certain strands of Hinduism. But let's start by saying that Hinduism is commonly wrapped up with 2 different prohibitions, and I think sort of mistakenly. One is against the consumption of beef, and one is against the consumption of all meat. It's true that many Hindus do refrain from either beef or all forms of meat, but the lived reality and also the textual reality is a lot more complicated. The most ancient known Hindu document that considers food and dietary prohibitions is the Charaka Samhita. It's written around 1500 before the Common Era by the physician Charaka. And in that text, there's dietary principles that are identified. There's permitted and prohibited foods and regimes or regimens for various diets. That text identifies food items that are designated as unwholesome and which are to be avoided by the majority of people. Some of them will feel a little obscure to us, things like black lentils, water from a rainy season river, beef, young dove, frogs, sheep milk, and elephant fat. Then later on, Hinduism changes a little bit. There's an expansion and further development for Hindu food codes in texts that later get called the Dharma Sutra. They're derived from an oral tradition that come from around 1500 before the Common Era, and they're written down by the 6th century before the Common Era. To understand food prohibitions broadly across religions, we're going to look at two influential interpretations. Neither of these interpretations offered by anthropologists has really won the debate, but they give us a good dichotomy or a good set of principles for thinking about food taboos and religion in a broad sense. The classic debate revolved around the question of why Jews, and to a lesser extent Muslims, didn't eat pork. But later on, this debate among anthropologists has been a little extended, so it includes the question of why Hindus broadly refrain from eating beef. This debate gets associated strongly with two anthropologists. The first was Mary Douglas, who was a British social anthropologist and a proponent of structural analysis. And the second is Marvin Harris, who's an American anthropologist associated with a school called cultural materialism. Let's explore the first position, Mary Douglas and her symbolic interpretation of food taboos. So here's Mary Douglas's deconstruction of a meal. What's going on there? Can we make sense of all these symbols? What are all the tables? What's the obsession with the divine? Mary Douglas dedicated much of her anthropological life to understanding the symbolic registers and meaning of food, and she took her inspiration broadly from her mentor, Claude Lévi-Strauss. Mary Douglas sought to understand why there was a religious Jewish prohibition against pork. And in a famous essay called The Abominations of Leviticus, she sees that pigs are classificatory monsters for Hebrews. They're not cloven-hoofed, they don't chew their cud. She argues that for many people, and for the Hebrews in particular, prohibiting certain foods was a way of carving up the natural world into the pure and the impure, thereby creating on earth this kind of model for thinking about the purity of the divine world. She notes that many biblical prohibitions are against things that are partial, maimed, or blemished, things that are clean or unclean. There's a real similar biblical obsession with this. Animals that are sacrificed can't have a blemish. No one who has a physical defect can become a priest. Even fields are only supposed to be sown with a single kind of seed. And so Mary Douglas suggested that prohibitions on food represent a means of creating order within a particular environment. And certain animals for Mary Douglas served as models of the divine order. Cattle and sheep were the most familiar, and so the Hebrew law stated that those animals represented order. Animals that didn't have those same characteristics were considered disorderly. So things like pigs, camels, and other animals were considered ritually impure to the early Jews. Mary Douglas said that the biblical focus on order makes dietary rules signs which at every turn inspired meditation on the oneness, purity, and completeness of God. And for Mary Douglas, taboos were ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions. They're a way of imposing order on an inherently untidy world. That's their biggest function more than anything else. This is a position that we would call symbolist. It's attentive to the different meanings of objects and their place in the world. Marvin Harris, as an anthropologist, was described as a cultural materialist. He argued in his writing that raising pigs in the settings of the ancient Near East was too expensive from an adaptive point of view. Therefore, he suggested that food taboos came from ecological reasons. Pigs are best adapted to places like forests or glens or riverbanks, places where they've got a lot of mud and they can forage or root around. Those are places that have lots of shade, water, and food. Raising a pig in an open, arid environment requires a much greater expenditure of water and supplementary food. And to make matters worse, pigs eat what humans eat. Sheep, goat, and cattle all thrive on grass, and they give you things like wool, milk, and labor. But pigs compete with humans for food, and so they're much more expensive for a given place to produce. The usual reason given for the prohibition on the consumption of pork is that the pig is seen as a dirty animal. It's impure, unclean, and therefore not to be eaten. That's kind of Mary Douglas's position. But Marvin Harris argued that if you looked at the material conditions of production in specific habitats, and particularly thinking about the pig in the Middle East, a pig is the last kind of domesticated animal that you would want to rear in that particular environmental context. While pigs were originally domesticated in the Middle East, and they were raised and consumed for around 6,000 years before these prohibitions became widespread, they nonetheless were adapted to ecological situations which were rare in the Middle East and became rarer as time went on. For Marvin Harris, this idea of ecological change helped explains why the prohibition changed over time and why it disappeared from certain communities. Christianity moved to Europe, and in Europe you had forests where pigs are able to roost, and attitudes change about the ecological competitiveness of pigs. So we've got to make a decision as we think about food taboos for ourselves. It's clear that religious life has all kinds of opportunities for fasting and feasting, and that food is at the center of all sorts of religious life. But when speaking about food prohibitions, we can start to think about them by looking at two influential positions. First, symbolism, where food reflects an imagined cosmic reality and it's brought down to earth. And by contrast, the idea of cultural materialism, where no religious taboo or prohibition exists without a specific ecological reason. Are any of these more correct than the other? Probably not, but it's really good for us to have these kinds of toolkits that we can use as we think about food prohibitions, which will come up again and again over time. To help us think through these questions a little bit more, we're going to talk with someone who's a real expert on how people make meaning through food, and that's Professor Heather Paxson. Dr. Paxson is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Anthropology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she's also chair of the department. And among other books, she's the author of a fantastic monograph published by the University of California called The Life of Cheese: Crafting Food and Value in America. Here's our conversation.
I'm Heather Paxson, and I'm a professor of anthropology at MIT, and I study food. I came to food accidentally. I did my dissertation research in Athens, Greece, and I studied changing ideas about fertility and fertility control as a window on how kinship and gender were changing. I lived in Greece for 2 years and thought I was a Europeanist and wrote my dissertation and wrote my book and didn't get a real job immediately. And I was looking for a second research project that I could do without any institutional support. And I was living in Manhattan at the time and shopping at the Union Square Green Market and enjoying the food there. But in particular, I was curious about the cheese. This is around 2000, like the turn of the millennium. And there were stalls of these European-style cheeses, these smelly, stinky, unique cheeses that were not meant to be put in a mac and cheese casserole, that were expensive and the kind of thing that you would eat with a glass of wine or a salad. These were cheeses that did not exist when I was a kid growing up in the States. So these were new American artisan cheeses, and I was just curious as a consumer where they came from. I started talking to the producers and I learned more and realized one of the people I was buying cheese from I had actually gone to college with. And he had been a philosophy major, and like, how did he go from philosophy major to cheesemaker? So as an anthropologist, I realized behind these new foods were new stories. I ended up writing a book about American artisan cheesemaking and revival of craft practices in the United States. I started out in New England, and I followed cheeses to their makers from Formaggio Kitchen, which happened to be in the neighborhood where I was living in Cambridge. And I spent a summer in Vermont. And then the second summer, I spent half the summer in Wisconsin and half the summer in California. And during those times, I drove around to cheesemakers and I did interviews. I spent 1 week on a sheep dairy farm in Vermont. living in a barn with a college intern who was there for the summer and helping in all facets of farmstead cheese production, from milking sheep to making cheese and aging it. And I held a ewe in my lap as the farmer pulled the kid out of the lamb out of the sheep. It was pretty intense. It was great. But mostly it was interview based, and I did a lot of eating. So an ethnographic interview, I think, is quite different than a journalistic interview, in part because we aren't trying to get the basic picture. We're trying to learn what people think about what they're doing, how they feel about what they're doing, what their anxieties are about what they're doing. One of my most productive questions was, what makes an artisan cheese artisanal? Because it was making explicit what was implicit. And almost everybody I asked, they just paused and then they would just break into a broad smile and start laughing, because they had no idea how to answer the question, right? This is their livelihoods, right? This is what they do. But to actually articulate it, it often turned into a really interesting conversation, because it was a question that they hadn't been asked before either. Artisan cheese making in the United States today is obsolete. How they're making cheese is in many ways very similar to how cheese was made 200 years ago. It had been made obsolete by pasteurization and economies of scale and automation and so forth. What makes it worthwhile using obsolete technologies and literally backbreaking labor-intensive means of production to create a food that's more expensive, right, than because of all the labor, than what is available in the supermarket? How do they understand the worth of what they're doing to themselves? And then how do they try to convey that worth to others? And to do that, they're unpacking the relationship between these multiple values to what they're doing. That there are social values, there are ideas about custom and tradition, it reflects a certain care of the animals that they are committed to, and all these sorts of things that add up to then being an expensive thing to produce, which means that it has this economic value attached to it too. Cheese is a means of preserving milk. It's a pretty basic food, and it's also a food that comes in pretty much endless forms, varieties, and flavors, and now also modes of production. I feel very strongly that there's a place for industrially processed cheese at the same time that there's a place for an artisanally made cheese. But they're very different foods in terms of their position in a cuisine, as well as obviously their affordability and whether they're an everyday thing or a special occasion thing. It's such a versatile food that it can fill all these different niches in the range of things that make up our diets, because we all have everyday foods and special occasion foods that we have attachments to and are fond of, but we don't think of as interchangeable. What makes a meal? In many cuisines, there's a staple starch or a staple ingredient that without it, a meal is lacking in some way, often, or a root vegetable in the Pacific or something like this. So that's one thing. Is there a defining component that makes a meal and everything else is a snack? But there's also, what is the occasion? What is the setting? Does it have to be at a table with utensils? What is a meal defined against? Is it defined against a snack or against grazing? I think a lot of college students just eat little bits as they go throughout the day in a continuous string of things. Is it eating with others? Is eating in a solitary thing, even if it's with utensils, is that still not fully a meal unless you're sharing it with others? Commensality is the word for sitting at table, right? Sharing food at table. And for many people, it's sharing food that it's important to reading the meaning of having a meal. So Harris and Douglas are both trying to read the significance of food taboos that we see repeated across cultures and religions and times. And Mary Douglas is looking for patterns of meaning. I think that they can't answer the question of why the taboos exist. And Douglas knows that. And so she's not really making that argument. She's saying, what can we learn from the fact that happens in a patterned way, and what kinds of patterns are structuring how we might think about eating in meals in ways that we aren't fully aware of until they're brought to our attention. Harris, on the other hand, is actually suggesting that there is a functional reason for these taboos that would then explain it. And a symbolic anthropologist like Douglas would say that's a logical fallacy. It's a neat argument. It could be true, but there's no way of demonstrating it on the basis of evidence, which is not available to us. One thing we're seeing in food studies recently is to realize that humans are not the only eaters, that animals eat, and plants actually also derive nourishment from their environment and surroundings. And so some anthropologists are trying to ask, what can we see differently about eating to recognize that human eating is not the only form? So that's interesting. And to realize that the things that we eat have eaten themselves. Another thing that we're going to see more of is today, we really can't think about food without recognizing how much the pandemic has not only affected things like commodity chains, food chains, we're seeing stress points. The demise of restaurants is enormous in terms of labor, but also in terms of the people who source the food for restaurants. And then people are thinking newly about comfort food. I think what people want to eat is somewhat affected by this too. Being able to share a meal together, the conviviality part of it, that has changed as well. So I think we'll be seeing people talk about our pandemic year of eating and the repercussions, seen and unseen, foreseen and unforeseeable, for some time to come.
All right, we've gone through everything, and now the question is whether I can actually get myself to eat this. It does look delicious, but it also makes me feel some kind of way. Very fatty, very porky. Wow.